Dan?
Hi, Glenn.
Michelle? Nice to see you again. Dave?
Hey, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Good seeing you.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Listen.
Well, I met
Peter is just. It was an incredible night, guys. We're talking December 31st, 1964, the basis for this book that you guys collaborated on. Excellent book. It is the most notorious event in terms of murders in Jefferson County, although there's been many, unfortunately, a lot of murders in Jefferson County over the years. But this one is the most prominent because it went to trial years after the actual date itself. It was 3 young people that were notoriously known for the wrong reasons. But on that night, guys, if we could start there, being in this setting as we are right now, in what was, Dan, what was the name of this restaurant again?
Red Moon Diner.
The Red Moon Diner next to the Rotary gas station.
Correct.
Which is mentioned, all of these names along Lower Court Street here are referenced in the book. And essentially, this diner, the Red Moon Diner, was the last place that all 3 of them were perhaps seen together. Is that correct, Dan?
That is correct.
And then from that point, they took a car drive in the Mercury, the station wagon, and they went over the Court Street Bridge, made a left onto West Main Street, managed to get on Bradley Street, and they went on then an on-ramp to a brand new interstate that wasn't even completed at the time, and went to the famous, what was now referred to as the Egan rest stop, about a couple of miles north of Watertown, and that's where it all happened. Now, Dave, there was a lot of speculation to why they were there at the rest stop itself. Why is it? There's a lot of theories that maybe there was going to be some type of shipment going over to Canada because of our proximity to Canada, and then there was other allegations that they were just going to be brought there to be killed.
Well, police were looking at a variety of things, whether there's gambling involved or prostitution or narcotics trafficking. But what we found is that basically there was a conspiracy to get rid of the Egans, for accomplices, associates, to protect themselves from being arrested in a burglary investigation.
So there they are at the rest stop. The younger of the 2 Egans, Gerald Egan, is the driver. Although he didn't even want to be there that night because it's New Year's Eve and apparently he had a date, but somehow or other he was convinced to go drive to this location. Is that correct, Dan?
That is correct. He was playing pinball right next door where the Red Moon or the Rotary gas station was located. He begged out of it, but Pete insisted he needed him that night to go along with the hijacking of the liquor truck.
So the premise was they were going to rendezvous at the rest stop, maybe perhaps meet someone from on the other side of the Canadian border. They were going to hijack a truck, and that's what they were waiting there for. Now, it is alleged, obviously, because of the casings, that there were 2 guns used that night. We have 3 dead bodies, and 2 of them which were in the vehicle. That's both Peter in the passenger seat, Gerald in the driver's seat. But, and this is how it was discovered by these poor unfortunate people driving up from Rochester back to their house, or their old house rather, in St. Lawrence County. They drive by to, apparently for the man to relieve himself. He sees a 1955, I believe, Mercury station wagon situated up in front of him at the rest stop, but he notices a body lying on the ground, thinking that maybe someone's sick in need of attention. He walks up to it, notices a woman, which obviously is Barbara Egan's body, and a pool of blood. And at that point, he opens up the car door, and just as he does that, the 2 bodies that were in there, actually, what happened when he opened up the door, Dan?
They slumped forward.
Just now, not only is there a dead woman lying right adjacent to the car, perpendicular to the Mercury, but there's 2 dead people in there. And at that point, the J family, as we know from your book, what do they do next, Dan?
They looked for places to stop, to get some help, make a phone call. They looked all over. They couldn't find anybody. They finally found a home. Was it Coleman?
A Coleman house, a farmhouse. There were lights on, so they stopped there and went to the door, and the frantic people were allowed into the house and to make a phone call to police.
It's New Year's Eve. They had to travel upwards of like maybe 3-4 miles to get to a house that they thought would be open and would have a phone for them to call the authorities. They call the authorities, and so at that point, the authorities get involved and they converge on the actual rest stop itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm just going to jump into December 31st. And they came here that night, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Afternoon, actually.
In the afternoon, right. But this was the hangout, just
They
like the old
were
bar.
here all day. They came early in the morning, actually.
Right.
like 9 o'clock in the morning, and
Right.
they'd go back and forth.
Right.
Pickett was there, Joe Leone, Gerald, Peter.
Right.
Barbara wasn't with them. Had the kids.
She had the kids,
Yep.
but she later dropped off the kids in various spots.
Yep.
It's a gray area, but she had curlers in her hair. She was planning on going out that night,
Yep.
but they more than likely left here, dropped off the kids at around 7, but wound up getting at the rest stop at around 7:30 up there at the rest stop.
Yeah, that's what the police say.
There had to be another car there because if you're killing 3 people, you're not walking away.
Right. James Pickett told me they drove Joe Leone's girlfriend Beth Johnson's car down
Right.
there that night, a Comet,
Right.
62 Comet, I believe it was.
Now, when the cops get to the site, they see the 3 Egans are dead. It probably wasn't a big surprise at that point. The Egans weren't the best people in the world, Dan.
No, the Egans made a lot of enemies everywhere they went. They were notorious thieves. Pete was a pimp. Barbara was a prostitute. Barbara was arrested 3 times in 1962. Gerald was arrested 3 times in 1962. Peter had a history of over a dozen arrests as early as 1952, I think it was, when he was 13 years old. He stole the car.
And Peter also, like I mentioned, had one leg. He lost it, I believe, in Nevada in a really bad car crash. By the time he gets back to a hospital in Syracuse, they realize he has gangrene, so they have to cut his leg off.
Right.
So at that point, it looks like he's not really going to be the tough guy anymore. But in essence, he really was. He was a fighter. He was an outdoorsman as well.
Right. And in reality, people have said that he was the first one to be out involved in a fight, and he would do well in holding his own. About Barbara, shoplifting was probably her game, and she would often bring her boys, 1, 2, or 3 of them, in a store with her. And we've been told actually the storekeepers would order the boys would not be allowed into the stores.
So the reputation obviously wasn't really stellar. It was pretty poor.
They were well known.
We're right here because this was their place. This was their hangout. Not to mention, many of the fights that Peter, or for that matter Gerald, got involved might have taken place in the bar that's still there today.
Right across the street.
So it was noted in the book that Peter would take on maybe 1, 2, 3 people at a time and do quite well, even with one leg.
He wasn't afraid of anybody.
So what is it? We're talking about tough Irish kids, maybe not from the best background. They were brought up here, I believe, in Watertown or somewhere in Duffy Street.
Well, I know their father drank himself to death in 1963. He was 48 years old.
So the upbringing, the household, perhaps might have really had a negative association with their future activity.
A lot of alcohol flowing through the house.
It was also noted in the book, guys, that it wasn't uncommon where if you were friends with the Egans, it was a good chance that if you lived next to someone, who might have had some property to be stolen, the Egans would ultimately walk into their neighbor's house, and when the neighbors obviously weren't there, and steal money or any heirlooms in there. And that seemed to happen quite a bit with these guys.
Yes, they were prolific thieves.
Let's go back to December 20th, 1964, just a couple of weeks before the murders. It looks like at that point, this is the catalyst to what happens on New Year's Eve. They robbed the wrong house, it looks like, because there's a man by the name of Joe Leone, who, although is associated with the Egans, with their wrongdoings, discovers through the grapevine that his parents' house on Duffy Street, right here in Watertown, was robbed by Peter Egan. Is that true, Dan?
Gerald and a teenage accomplice entered the home of Anthony Leone, and they stole $760 in cash and a diamond ring.
Joe finds out about this and immediately figures that it's clearly the Egan brothers that are responsible for it. So he must have put him between a rock and a hard place, because he's friends with them, he's associated with them in terms of this alleged burglary ring. But at this point, he feels very, very slighted. This is a personal thing to him because it's his family who loses the heirloom, and I believe upwards of $756.
The Egans must have struck.
I was just going to
So Joe Leone at that point is very, very angry, but it makes it known, I believe, to Peter himself that on the 31st that he might be a dead man. Is that correct?
That's correct. A man named Joe Ganoski. He was a well-known businessman in Watertown. The Egans apparently robbed him on more than one occasion. They burglarized his place and stole old coins. Then Peter goes to another card game, and he starts bragging about stealing from the Gnoski. The word got back to Gnoski that Peter Egan was the one that stole his coins. So Mr. Gnoski wasn't very happy about that. He said if Peter Egan didn't have his $1,000 by December 31, he's a dead man.
That's a heck of a claim. I mean, he actually lays down the date. Is there any foundation to why he picks the 31st as a date to take him out?
I have no idea.
Just being it's the end of the year, I suppose.
So Peter, at this point, is a very paranoid man, leading right up to being right in this restaurant at the time, telling people that he's in a lot of trouble. He's looking for, I believe, a shotgun that very day.
Right across the street, he went running in and asked the man in there if he could borrow his sawed-off shotgun.
And did he explain why he needed the shotgun?
He just said he was very nervous and excited. He didn't stick around long.
So it's the 31st. People are expecting to celebrate the New Year's just like we do in any given year, so it's no different. That day, we mentioned it earlier, that Gerald is looking, I believe he has a date that night. He doesn't want to go off in this alleged scheme to hook up with some Canadian guy in a truck they're going to hijack. But nonetheless, he's convinced by his own brother Peter that he wants him there. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. And another guy by the name of Joe Leone is saying, no, he doesn't have to go. He can stay home, have his date. But Peter insisted, no, he's gonna go with us.
Now, at that point, because Joe obviously is the guy that people pin as one of the two shooters,
That's correct.
He's probably setting that up as a little foreshadowing because he wants Peter. He doesn't want Gerald or Barbara in that car at all.
That's what it looks like to us, yes.
So things don't seem to work out. You got a couple other people involved, Joe Leone and another man by the last name of Pickett. Is that correct?
Correct. James Pickett.
Now, James was a close personal friend of Joe Leone.
Yes, lifelong best friend.
And he testified in his defense. In some allege that he might not have, Mr. Pickett might not have had the right details on Mr. Leone's whereabouts on the 31st.
Correct. Pickett testified that Joe Leone told him right here that he murdered the Egans. This was a few days after January 1st when Pickett claims Joe Leone acted like it was the first time he ever heard about the murders was the morning of January 1st when James Pickett told him right here in the Red Moon Diner.
Yeah, so it's the next day. Pickett actually meets up with Joe the next day after the murders. The entire county knows about this. Headlines across the country are essentially covering this major triple murder, which again, back in the early 60s, wasn't as common, unfortunately, as it is today. It's a little more than a year after JFK is assassinated. A lot of people look at that era as the end of innocence. Certainly, when you're living in Jefferson County, you realize that 3 residents are executed gangland style on a rest stop that's just been built. They must think that the world is coming to an end. It's like, wow, this is all of a sudden the world is a much more dangerous place. The next day, Pickett and Mr. Leone are in this diner on January 1st, 1965, and Dan presents the question to him to hear about the murders, but Joe Leone plays it at least that he didn't hear anything about it.
Correct.
It was news to him. He hadn't heard anything about it.
Interesting, considering even people who didn't even know the Egans knew something about it, and yet the next day he claims to not know anything
Joe
about it.
testified he stayed home that night. He went out to buy a pint of liquor and a pack of cigarettes and was home by 7:30.
We're still going? Yep, we're all good.
Okay. So, just to clarify here, these guys were burglarizing homes all throughout Watertown here and throughout the county. And it seemed like they had an in because there was yet another mysterious woman who is known to perhaps to be a woman of the night who ran some type of cleaning service, like a maid service. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have Bertha Belcher who would do house cleaning, and then she'd come back, and so apparently she was telling her associates where to go, what to find, and she was sort of a kingpin in this whole burglary operation, and that's Bertha Belcher. And Bertha, she was a mademoiselle in Watertown. She was quite well known, Ma Belcher, I think they called her.
Yep.
And she was married to?
Her husband was about 20 years her junior, and that would be Willard Belcher.
And Willard Belcher, of course, was also implicated as being one of the shooters in this triple murder.
He was implicated but never charged.
Never charged. And of course, Mr. Pickett was also the other guy that could have been, again, we're talking about 2 guns used in this because, like we noted earlier, Peter and his brother Gerald was shot with the same pistol that night in the Mercury. Yet another caliber pistol a .38, if I'm not mistaken, was used to kill Barbara Egan,
Right.
who perhaps it is alleged saw that her husband Peter was shot, and then his brother Gerald was shot, and at that point she obviously saw the opportunity to get out of the vehicle, and then she literally ran, I guess, tried to run across Route 81, which has just been built, and it is alleged that one of the shooters got out of the vehicle, got to her, and actually dragged her by her hair after perhaps shooting her in the middle of Route 81, because there was blood later on seen on the roadway indicating that not only was she shot in the roadway, but she was dragged back to the rest stop. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was still in her hair curlers because she was hoping to go out New Year's Eve over at Watertown Bowl. Some of those curlers were found at the murder scene, so it appears that she was indeed dragged by her hair back to the car, and her body was found alongside the passenger side of the car.
Now, people later on, witnesses attested that the car was there at around 7:30. But I guess a little bit after that, that's when the Jays, who were coming up from Rochester to go back to their former home in St. Lawrence County, that's when he discovered the body. But at that time, he didn't do anything other than to get back in the car, tell his wife, and that's when they went to the Coleman's house
Right,
at the intersection of 342 and Route 11.
Yes, they drove around looking for phone booths or looking for an open business. But once again, it was New Year's Eve and everybody's closed down. They didn't see any phone booths, so they found this farmhouse with the lights on, and that's where they stopped.
The Jays discovered the bodies at 9:30.
About 9:30 there, around that time at least, that's when the bodies are discovered.
Correct.
Let's talk about Barbara. You know, in the book, it shows that one, she was a smart, intelligent girl from South Jefferson, did very well in school, very attractive, had almost married a very respectable guy prior to meeting Peter. But one infamous night, I guess, she meets him at a YMCA dance. And at that point, that's when she, somehow or other, just like Betty Boop, if you will, she really falls in love with this truly bad boy. And why is that? Does anyone know why a young woman like that, who obviously had a good outlook on her life, decides to get associated with this guy?
From what we've been told, she was already into doing some shoplifting with one of her classmates. And so I think she was destined for a wild life. So, yeah, she gets introduced to this guy, Peter Egan, at this dance, and her classmates say she was just attracted to the bad guys.
And that's ultimately what led to her death, because, you know, she's associated with a bad guy who's grown up that way. But like you said, Dave, she had that inclination to be a bad person even prior to even meeting Peter.
Yeah, she was sneaking out and using a friend as an alibi, so the friend would have to lie to her parents about where she was. That's probably somewhat typical of teenagers these days, however. We do find indication that she was unhappy with this life eventually, and she would tell people that she really wanted to get out of that arrangement, but she did get out of it, unfortunately, fatally.
It's interesting, we're sitting right here on Lower Court Street, and Peter was in and out of jail for all types of actions or criminal activity, one of which I believe was he got a drunk driving conviction. And it wasn't uncommon to see Barbara actually speak to Peter right on the street level as he was in his jail cell. So that just adds more to this area right here. This was the place they hung out. The Rotary gas station was apparently their hangout because there was, you know, back then they had pinball machines inside gas stations. And then across the way was the restaurant and the bar. So this Lower Court Street was pretty active for these guys.
Yeah. Ground zero for the Egans.
The 31st, however, you know, they're told that there's going to be some type of truck to be hijacked. All three of them get into her car, the Mercury station wagon, and on top of that, there's two people, obviously, because it is alleged, because of the casings. There's two shooters in the back seat, and then on top of that, there's a dog in the car. Whose dog was that?
Queenie, that's Barbara's dog, little fella, and so he's believed to be the only living witness to the shootings.
If two men are in the back seat of the Mercury, and they shoot the two brothers in the front seat, and then one gets out of the car, it is alleged, and kills Barbara Egan in the middle of the road and drags her back. The car is still left there with all three bodies, one outside the vehicle, two inside the vehicle. How did the triggermen themselves leave the rest stop? Because there's no residents near there and get away with it. No footprints, there was no snow that night either to indicate there was a second car. What is How do you think, Dan, they got out of there?
James Pickett, one of the conspirators, told me that Joe Leone and Willard Belcher rode down to the rest area that night in Joe's girlfriend's car. That would be Beth Johnson. Pickett told me that his job was to take Barbara away from the rest area. He told me that she drove away in Beth Johnson's car and returned. And upon returning to the rest area, she discovered dead bodies of her husband and brother-in-law, possibly even heard the shots go off. She started to run, and that's when Joe Leone fired 3 shots at her through the windshield with a .38.
Missed her.
Missed her, chased her down, caught her, stomped her, shot her, dragged her back behind the car.
What car did they manage to get back in and get out of that location?
Yes, that would have been Beth Johnson's 1962 Comet.
Looks like they got away with it because they didn't leave much evidence. Of course, no DNA back then. It seems like they committed the perfect crime.
Right. No fingerprints were found at the scene. The Egan stopped and bought 2 pair of gloves at 7:30 on Bradley Street. When the police found the bodies, only 1 pair of gloves was found. So the police theorized if they could locate the other pair of gloves, they could find out who killed them.
You know, Peter was a big spender. I believe earlier that day, he went right over to West Main Street, which is a stone's throw away from where we are right now, and made a purchase of over $200 in merchandise, which, again, back in 1964 is a lot of stuff. So although they weren't working, and they were on social services, it seemed like they had a lot of money.
Well, Barbara was into the prostitution angle. Pete would take her up to Camp Drum every payday. Soldiers would line up and have their way.
And you talk about a lot of money. Well, they were on welfare for a while, but the welfare was cut off because the government found out that they were like Peter was lending a lot of money out, and he was flashing at the bars, and actually Barbara complained one time that he had loaned out so many $1,000s and wasn't getting it back.
How can a guy like that, who was so mean and would actually use his wife or pimp his wife out to complete strangers, actually lend out money and not actively get it back like a thug that he apparently was? In other words, if he's a loan shark guy, wouldn't he demand the money to be back with a lot of interest?
That's a reasonable question. We don't have an answer.
So he was kind of a fickle guy. And getting back to the crime scene, a lot of people can't understand how he's in the front seat, allowing someone to sit behind him because he knew that his life was in danger. But I guess because he knew Joe Leone and he knew Pickett, that he felt comfortable that night, right, Dan? Right, Dave?
He had to have trusted who was in the back seat, because he was conscious about having people behind him. Of course, he thought that they were going to hijack a truck. Although, when he was playing a machine there in the gas station.
Yeah, the same day.
Yeah, that evening he made some comment about this may be my last night.
And Joe Leone's in the gas station at the same time.
Yes, he is.
So doesn't he know that it's Joe that perhaps might be the trigger man that would take his life that night?
Well, I think he's worried about this guy Ganaski. Joe Ganaski was he was a military veteran, retired, and like we said, his place had been ripped off, burglary, and he supposedly put out the word that if his money isn't returned to him by the end of the year, Peter's a dead man.
So let's maybe put 2 pieces together here. The Leone family, Joe's family, is robbed on December 20th, 1964. A family heirloom and a lot of cash. And plus, Joe Leone knows the Egans and he feels betrayed by this. Then Ganowski probably approaches Joe and says, hey, he stole money from me too. So I give you money to set up some type of scheme to get these guys in a situation where you can take them out without anyone knowing it. Is that a good allegation?
It's certainly plausible.
Let's go back to January 1st. Again, they come back to their favorite stomping ground. The name of this restaurant again, Dan?
Red Moon Diner.
Red Moon Diner. They might have sat right in this very booth. Mr. Pickett, and Mr. Leone, and Pickett says later that he talked to Mr. Leone and said, did you hear about the murders last night? And Joe Leone said,
Right. Joe said no. That was the first he heard. Joe was having coffee with his girlfriend Beth Johnson. Joe acted like he'd never heard it. That was the first he heard of it.
Joe is an imposing guy because it is stated in the book that he's like the leader of the gang. Explain that, either one of you.
Joe was a very popular person as a kid. His father was Kid Sullivan, famous boxer in Watertown. So everybody wanted to be Joe Leone's friends. That's how James Pickett met him, through his father's boxing circle.
And he was a famous boxer.
Yes, he was. He boxed extensively around the country, and toward the end of his career, he fought here in Watertown and even wrestled a bear.
And also, Joe was called the bread man, right?
Yeah, he drove the Wonder Bread truck.
And as a kid, you actually knew him. Is that correct?
I did. Yep. He delivered the bread to Redwood, my hometown of Redwood. And every week he would give me a free box of donuts. It was expired stuff he took off the shelves in the store. And that went on for about a year.
And
Until he got arrested for triple murder.
so Jay, the fellow coming up from Rochester, sees that there's a dog in there. He's barking up a storm. He's got blood on him because he's on the shoulders of one of the deceased.
Yeah.
There's probably blood all over the place from the shots. And you're not going to get much testimony from a dog. And that said, unfortunately, little Queenie apparently was inherited by someone else that week, and only 2 weeks later was killed and run over by a vehicle.
That's true. And I suppose, if Queenie had survived, maybe if they brought a suspect in front of the dog, maybe they'd hope to get some kind of violent reaction from the dog. But that didn't materialize, obviously.
A lot of police officers at the scene. They were all taken from various parties. Again, it's New Year's Eve, and it is at any time do they think they know, even despite the fact that they're doing roadblocks up near the bridge and some areas of the county. Is there any indication that they might have known who would have done this right away?
Within 2 days, or even less than 2 days, the police were questioning the very people who eventually became suspects in the case. They were very quickly pointed to a burglary ring, and they were ruling out all the other possibilities like narcotics, trafficking, gambling, prostitution. But they had a good start in the investigation, but they were having issues about developing any evidence that would bring about an immediate arrest.
They actually do some stakeouts. Long before the days of real investigating, they really didn't know what they were doing. In fact, they went into someone's house to plant a microphone, and they didn't have the staples and the staple gun to plant the actual microphone onto a sofa. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the investigators are Ray Paulette and Charlie Donahue. Ray Paulette is still living down in Florida, and he told us how they were using Donahue's staple gun, and they were planting a bug beneath the couch. They pulled the fiber out and planted the bug, the microphone, and started using the stapler, and lo and behold, it was empty. So they actually had to leave, go over to Donahue's house to get some staples, and then come back. And of course, they're worried about somebody's going to come home. But in the return trip, they were still able to complete that job and get out of there.
And which house was this again?
Well, it's a neighbor's house. It's not identified whose, but it's about a block away from the Belcher residence. Well, the bug was in the Belcher residence.
And that must have been interesting because, like Dan said, Bertha was a lady of the night, and here it is. They're bugging the apartment, and they heard some of the Johns obviously.
Oh yeah, Bertha had her lovers. There were some guys that really told her how much they loved her, and Ray and Charlie are hearing this conversation and getting some good entertainment about it.
That in itself is a story, but again, that's what the police obviously had to, I guess, through a matter of elimination, say that Mr. Belcher was perhaps not the trigger man that night because he never went to trial.
Well, the reason he didn't go to trial is because he was in prison and was ruled criminally insane, and so they had a warrant for him. The warrant got dropped.
We don't need to get into all the details, but I'll say, in the end, it works. But the trial doesn't happen until another 4 or 5 years later.
Yes, the arrest happened in March 1968, and the trial started in January 1970.
So Joe Leone sat in jail for 2 years waiting for his trial.
And did he sit in the jail cell or in the jailhouse right down the block from here?
Jefferson County Jail, right within sight of here.
Isn't that something?
He was watching the police dive the Black River looking for the murder weapons from
Yeah.
his jail cell.
And why are they looking in the Black River for the murder weapon?
Well, supposedly, I guess James Pickett told them where to look. Because, everything happened because James Pickett opened his mouth. He told me that they weren't even looking in the right place for the weapons.
So he might have led them there just for the heck of it then, knowing that the guns wouldn't be found there because nothing was found in the Black River.
Nothing was found.
And supposedly, Leone is watching it from his jail cell. He's supposedly laughing at what he's watching.
Incredible. Now, there's some incredible things that we just learned recently. Here it is, we're sitting in Lower Court Street in October of 2014. Anytime anyone looks at the front cover of the book, if we just mentioned it, especially anyone older than 65 years old, knows that night and how infamous it was. But you, Dan, found out something that's not even in the book. It's an allegation. It's one of the elements that obviously can't be substantiated. But someone claims that the old Rotary gas station, which was right next door, might have been the resting place for the weapons.
I was told that about a week ago at one of our book signings. It was a gentleman that appeared to know a lot about the case. He knew the Egans, he knew Joe Leone, he knew Pickett. He told me that's where the murder weapon ended up,
Inside the gas tank.
inside the gas tank.
Now, obviously, the gas station is no longer there. I'm assuming the tanks may or may not be there. But let's just say someone decides to exhume the old gas tanks. Maybe we can find 2 pistols under there.
It'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Well, we have a cast of characters. We have a lady of the night who's like 70 years old, who is not only a prostitute but runs this little burglary ring because she knows the insides of a lot of houses. She tells the Egans where to go and what to steal. So there's a conspiracy there. Her younger husband is alleged to have been one of the shooters. Of course, we've talked about Joe Leone, who ultimately goes on trial. A couple years later, he actually witnesses the police at the Black River, right at the base of the jailhouse. They're looking for these pistols. Of course, Mr. Pickett said that they might have been there. Joe's laughing, saying they're not there. There's other stories even to this day suggesting that the pistols were locked or were dropped inside a gas tank right next door, which was the Rotary gas station. But on top of all that, we have F. Lee Bailey. He comes up here in his Learjet for the prosecution.
The county paid him $3,000 to support the use of the lie detector test in the trial against Joe Leone. Now, this was in a preliminary hearing prior to any trial, and despite Bailey's testimony, in which he pointed out how he uses the lie detectors for his defendants, his clients, the courts ultimately threw out evidence from the lie detectors, as well as from evidence gained with from the bugging of the Belcher house.
And this is before the trial that starts
Before
in
the
1970.
trial.
Why does it take so long for the trial to start?
They had about 3 different hearings, I do believe, over the term of the last year or so. And of course, Judge Wilsey, the county judge, Milton Wilsey, threw out most of that evidence which we just discussed. But then it was appealed. There was evidence, both the defense and the prosecution were trying to get back. So it was brought to the higher court in New York State, and ultimately to the New York State Court of Appeals, the highest they could go in New York State. So you had a continuation of court hearings before they could go to trial.
When is Joe Leone officially acquitted?
The trial was in January, and the trial was, a couple of weeks maybe? And
Yep.
So he's acquitted in January.
In about 2 hours. The jury was at about 2 hours.
You would think a triple murder, especially by today's standards, and we've seen it before with high-profile cases, even lesser charges, where there might be just one murder or no murders, would go a lot longer than that. So is it because everyone kind of didn't care about the murders? Is that why the trial was delayed so long, and that's why the acquittal came so quickly?
It's hard to say.
Basically, the prosecution had lost their key evidence, and I suspect that maybe the prosecutor, maybe he didn't go down hard enough on Joe Leone in cross-examination from whatever testimony we could unveil. But I think McCluskey's hands were tied before he ever stepped foot in that courtroom.
She had 3 children. Apparently, they were unruly. And the kids were part of a shoplifting ring, so they weren't the most reputable family by any means. But again, on the 31st, she was responsible enough to actually, at one point, have all 3 kids in the car. But before leaving this restaurant or this block to go up to the rest stop off Route 81, she drops the 3 kids off with either her mother or someone else that night.
She dropped 2 of them off at a babysitter, and she dropped the other one off at her mother-in-law, Leona Egan, the Egan boy's mother.
And she still has her dog. Was it her dog or was it?
Yes, it was her Pekingese Queenie.
And any reason why? Did she always have a dog?
Apparently, they also had a pet monkey in their house. It was running loose and crapping all over the floors. The kids were filthy, never took baths. The mother didn't change their diapers. They were running around with soiled diapers.
They'd be running around outdoors in soiled diapers.
And people who knew Barbara as a young student in high school were quite surprised because she used to take care of her father's house and was always clean. And yet, obviously, because of her involvement with Peter, that all changed. It's also alleged because Peter was on painkillers that she was involved in narcotics and using narcotics as well.
Yes, that's what we hear. Peter was probably given morphine or something like that for his amputation. And Barbara soon started indulging in the drugs.
And this is a long time before, abuse of drugs was commonplace.
Right. They were probably Watertown's first junkies.
Now, guys, I gotta ask you. You were in first grade and you were in high school at the time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Correct.
Now, you remember it in first grade. Is that right, Dan?
I do.
What do you remember?
I remember being scared to death. It was hit pretty close to home. Everybody was scared. It was the talk of the town. We were 30 miles away in Redwood. There was a lot of repercussions in Redwood. This was before we knew Joe's involvement in it.
And when you found that Joe was involved in it, you knew him because he was, again, the bread man.
Yeah, that was pretty creepy there.
And did you ever see him after that, other than pictures
No,
in the paper?
it was the last time I saw him. I saw his pictures in the paper, and that was it.
And Dave,
I do not honestly recall knowing about it when I was in high school. That doesn't mean I didn't, but when you're in high school and you're involved in school activities, I guess you're not too much concerned about what's going on in the world around you.
But later on in life, Dan, of course, moves from Redwood in the 70s. He moved down to, at first, Tennessee and then to Kentucky.
Right.
But you were, can I say you were obsessed with this case?
Yeah, I still followed it through the years. My grandmother, her sister, was married to a man in Watertown who was distantly related to Joe Leone. So, I'd always keep up with my grandmother, keep updated on everything.
And then you started researching it.
Right.
But you needed the glue.
Right.
And the only reason why I say that is because you have a retired Watertown Daily Times writer here that had written a book before about a notorious murder in Jefferson County as well.
Right, and that's why I contacted Dave Champagne after reading his Stain in Her Blood, the Irene Isaac story. I wanted to get a hold of him and see if he would collaborate on this book.
Now, there's 2 things that connect the 2 murders. One, they both took place in the 60s. And the other fact is they both took place on Route 81. Isn't that strange?
Well, that's correct. I mean, Irene Isaac, actually, the state trooper who followed her that night actually first came upon her when she was in the rest area, which the police have come to call the Egan rest area, the same rest area where the triple homicide occurred.
So she stopped there at the same rest area.
Yes.
And then something goes on there. It is alleged that maybe he made a pass at her?
Well, officially the word is that he accused her of speeding. Later on, he changed his story about the speed, or that she was speeding at all. He followed her up to the toll booth for the Thousand Island Bridge. While she was talking to the toll gatekeeper, he crossed the bridge, and so he was on Wellesley Island before she was, and then he's the guy who discovers her body on Wellesley Island.
Boy, the irony's there. Not to mention, if I'm not mistaken, someone else was hit by a vehicle on 81 on the Bradley Street exit.
Joe Leone.
Joe Leone's father was a construction flagman, and he was killed at that Bradley Street exit.
Amazing. Well, I'm just very glad that you guys got together and collaborated on this. What's the response been so far since you've been at all these book signings recently?
huge, is the word I'd say. And,
Yeah.
and we have met a lot of people who, in some manner, they were involved as neighbors, work colleagues, relatives, you name it. We've had so many people tell us what they know about the Egans or Joe Leone, mostly the Egans.
And what's been the response to you?
Several relatives have come forward. I've actually befriended some of them on Facebook. And we've met two of Joe Leone's cousins, and we met James Pickett's daughters. It's overwhelming.
You know, it's really neat because just last week when we talked in this very restaurant here, now called Frida's, we had the opportunity to go across the street to the old stomping grounds where the Egans hung out. It's now called the Hitching Post, and it's owned by a Pickett. Hopefully we can speak to him as well about all this.
Right. Cliff Pickett owns the bar. He's the cousin of James Pickett. And Joe Leone is Clifford's godfather.
We were standing there looking up at a digital photo that would change from one picture to the other, and sure enough, one of the photographs is of Joe Leone.
Yeah.
So he has since passed on, but a lot of him, and for that matter, the Egans, a lot of their history, for better or worse, exists right here on Lower Court Street.
After the book went to press, an attorney contacted the History Press to say that somebody wanted to be interviewed about the case. And what we ultimately learned is that he's representing one of those three sons. We were told that one of the sons is now deceased, and we were told that after the murders occurred, those three sons were given protection under the witness protection program, given new identities, new names, and relocated. And now this one son wanted to get his story out, and he actually probably wants to do a book of his own.
Really? Is it as a result of this book that he wants to do a book of his own?
Yes, correct.
Unfortunately, they were innocent victims. Obviously, they weren't being raised correctly, and at that point, it was a reckless household. So that's what led to why a lot of retailers didn't want the Egan family to even walk in their place. But that wasn't by any means the blame of the three children.
Right.
That's for sure.
Well, guys, I want to thank you for taking the opportunity to meet me here. I know you're retired and you don't live here, but the book signings have been doing really well, and we welcome both of you home for all of this. And this book obviously is on a lot of people's minds, and it's certainly on mine. I want to thank you, Dan,
Thank you, Glenn.
for being on my radio show as well, and for coming down here and talking with me.